Thank you everyone so much for coming. My name is Paul and I'm co-editor-in-chief of the Brown Journal of World Affairs. Dr. Zarni is one of our contributors to the fall-winter issue, which will be coming out early next month. Just to briefly introduce our speaker, Maung Zarni has been a Burmese human rights campaigner for 3 decades. Currently, he is a non-resident fellow at the Documentation Center of Cambodia, where he specializes in genocide in Buddhist countries. Dr. Zarni combines insightful scholarship with passionate activism against what he has termed slow-burning genocide in Myanmar. Despite being branded an enemy of the state by the Burmese government and media outlets, he continues to speak out courageously. With his wife, he co-wrote the first academic study of the persecution of the Rohingya through a genocide framework, a topic that he elaborates upon in his forthcoming essay for the Brown Journal of World Affairs. With that, I'm thrilled to introduce our speaker, Dr. Zarni. And just a quick note, this does contain discussions of violence and other graphic aspects related to genocide, so if you need to step out, feel free to do so.
Thank you very much for coming to the talk today. Obviously, this is the least pleasant subject and also very relevant and contemporary because it is still unfolding. And it has been going on for almost 40 years. That is why I corrupted the original term genocide by qualifying it as the slow-burning genocide. What I'll do is 3 things. Tell 2 short stories that I heard firsthand from the female survivors of the genocide that just fled the country over the last 3 months. Now they are in Bangladesh. I was in Bangladesh for about a week visiting the camps and also meeting with them, talking to them in depth. And I will show maybe just about 4 minutes of a Sky exclusive report. The Sky is the private television channel in UK. I'm not sure if anyone has ever view any news items on Sky, but it was a very, very gripping first-hand reporting from inside the country, but on the periphery of where all that terror has been going on. And finally, I go through the outline of my talk. I termed this "A Picture is a Story." A picture is not just a picture; it captures the stories of people that wish their stories to be relayed. This is a pair of hands, and it could be anyone's, either man or woman, but in this case, it's a pair of hands of this young woman, 18 years old, recently forcibly widowed because her husband was shot as they attempted to flee the country when the Burmese soldiers arrived and started shooting indiscriminately in northern Arakan or Rakhine state adjacent to Bangladesh. You will notice that there is one small finger tip missing. And in one of the previous waves of genocidal attacks on her village, and there were about close to 300 villages burned to the ground as captured on satellite imageries provided by Human Rights Watch. That has been widely distributed through mass media. And in one of the previous waves of attacks that took place in 2012, she was only 13, and I wouldn't show her face out of respect. She was assaulted at the age of 13 as a young teenager by a group of Burmese soldiers. She was able to identify the uniform as well as the red scarf that soldiers or her attackers wore. Because I came from a Burmese Buddhist family with ties to the Burmese military, since its inception in the 1940s. So I was able to identify that the troops that attacked her were special forces or the commandos that were airlifted or that were mobilized for these assaults. So she described to me as I was interviewing her, and there were other women as well, about 12 other women, varying ages. She said her hands were tied, and it was lifted above her head as the soldiers, ripped her clothes. And she was a feisty little teenager, so she attempted to fight back. And one of the things that she attempted to do was untie the knot, from the rope. As she did that, because the soldiers viewed that as an act of resistance, which it was, they put her hand on a, on a table or something flat, and cut her fingertip. This is like a torture movie, that we generally see in action films. And then they proceeded to assault her. And now, like when I interview her, she was, she just about 2 weeks ago, she's already 18 with a little baby. And then another story, but there's no picture because no picture could be taken. There's another woman in her mid-20s, again, a Rohingya woman. She was telling me while holding her baby again that she ran as the troops arrived and heard she heard the gunfire, and then like trucks rolling into the main road or dirt road that divided her Rohingya community from a Buddhist community across the street or across the other side of the road. She grabbed the baby and she ran to the nearest place where she thought was safe, but it was, short distant enough so she could see what was happening. And they lived in a decent wooden house, so she saw her 16-year-old girl with a long black hair being dragged by a group of Burmese soldiers into the house. And there was a window through which she could see what was happening inside the house. And again, her sister, but these are two different women. So this woman in her 20s saw her sister dragged into the house, again like soldiers ripping the clothes off. And then there was her father, who also noticed what was happening as he ran. Instead of running for safety, out of a paternal instinct, he ran back to the house where his younger daughter was dragged by the soldiers. As the middle-aged man ran towards his house, he was shot from the back in the head. So she fell on the village ground not far from their home. And the brain got scattered. And one of the soldiers bent over and used his bare finger to pick the brain, what was left in his broken skull, picked it up, fed to the free-range chickens roaming in the village yard. I'm not trying to sensationalize. I'm trying to amplify and relay what I've been told. I still couldn't get over the fact that this was sadism at its most extreme. This isn't simply behavior of an army that simply wanted to drive people out of their villages. This isn't simply grabbing land. This isn't simply forcing people to flee. These are acts of sadistic genocidal killings. They were killed or they were raped not simply as lone human beings, but as members of a particular ethnic group or religious group called Rohingya. When troops, state actors, and non-state actors like, like hostile Buddhist, Rakhine, vigilantes, target people indiscriminately, including infants or immobile elderly people, on the basis of their identity. That takes up to the realm of essentially genocidal killings. So, but those two stories are just tip of the berg. At the rate of 100,000 Rohingya of all ages, 60% of whom were women and children, and some elderly people who were carried in bamboo basket with poles, or some simply in bamboo basket carrying, like grandmothers, grandfathers. At the rate of 100,000, they arrived in Bangladesh per week, every week, over the last 3 months. Close to 700,000 Rohingyas had filed into Bangladesh. But this clip that I want to show for the next 4 minutes captured those who remained trapped between the boundary river that divides Bangladesh and Western Burma, called River Nav. And they're trapped between this, river and the killers that pursue them on the beach. And I think you need to bear witness to this to get, to understand the scale of what is happening. And this is not over, it's still going on. Sorry. You can. Sorry. It got stuck or something.
Yeah.
Oh.
Oh, here, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
We pick our way through sleeping villages, down a sandy track to the meeting point at the water's edge in the south of Bangladesh. The fishermen who are taking us across to Myanmar fear being caught. They face arrest and jail. Others have had their boats destroyed. So this mission's done in silence, in the middle of the night. There's a lot of tension. The Bangladeshi authorities have banned all these boat journeys to Myanmar. They want to stem the flow of Muslim Rohingya refugees into their country. But these people insist there is a modern-day genocide happening there, today, right on their doorstep. And they believe they're answerable to a much higher authority. Whatever the boat's condition, they're going to make these journeys. The ban may have made it more difficult, but it hasn't stopped them. No one knows what to expect on the other side. Myanmar's Rohingya Muslim areas have been effectively cut off to outsiders. We're not even certain if the army will prevent us from landing. But as we draw near to the Myanmar shore, there are flashing lights guiding us in.
We have to get off.
Out of the darkness, we see a crowd already gathered.
Look at all these people here. They're all waiting to... For how long have they been here?
There's about over a month or some 2 months.
This lady looks so thin. Ask what's happened to her. Look at the state of her hands. Her arms. She can hardly walk. What? Carefully go. Wow, her arms. Look at her arms. I can put my entire hand round. She's so thin. Is she, are we going to try and get her onto a boat? There are old people. There are babies. Many of them are talking about being here for over a month. Clearly not had very much to eat at all. A lot of them extremely thin and very frail. And all showing extreme signs of desperation. Look. They want help. Yeah, they want help. They want help. They're crying out for help.
Women and children are the most vulnerable here, and they've repeatedly told us of being terrorized by the Myanmar military.
Look at all these children.
She's shivering out of fear rather than cold. This is Rakhine State, the centre of the Myanmar military's brutal crackdown, and we are the first outsiders here, the first to independently see what's being denied by the Myanmar authorities. They are desperate. Their hands are outstretched, begging to leave. The wailing is haunting. But no one is listening. Thousands of them are trapped on this beach alone, waiting for help which has so far failed to arrive.
I think the questions that I want to address, who are the Rohingyas? Why do Burma single them out for brutal, systematic persecution? What is the nature of persecution? You know, ethnic cleansing versus genocide, or ethnic cleansing and genocide. Is genocide or ethnic cleansing a conflict, as we have been told by the mass media and by the Burmese government, headed by Aung San Suu Kyi? Is it true that Rohingya militants themselves brought this upon their community? What is the role of Aung San Suu Kyi? That has been, a fair bit of media coverage on her supposed silence. And then finally, the role of geopolitics, i.e. the UN Security Council, international politics, how that trumps this sacred reminder, never again. Essentially, this is the issue of a people that James Scott at Yale called Borderlands people. Because modern boundaries are fictional, drawn up only after the end of World War II. There are people whose communal, linguistic, historical ties to their own communities got split up into different nation states. And this is not, Rohingyas are not a unique phenomena, whether you go to Pakistan or Afghanistan or Europe, places like Poland, Ukraine. Boundaries and communities go, they swing depending on who is controlling the political entities. So the Rohingyas are concentrated in the the western part of Burma, adjacent to Bangladesh. If you look at the map of Burma, it looks like a kite with a long tail there. And we are surrounded by 5 different countries, and also right next to the Bay of Bengal that connects to Andaman Sea and then the Indian Ocean. And if you look right above the tip, right here, that's East Bengal, and then you've got West Bengal, Kolkata. And the Rohingyas are borderland people whose identity has always been in influx or formation, because this is a coastal area. So that's where the different waves of migrations hit Burma. Ideas, goods, people, that's kind of like the first port of entry. It's like a New England. You don't get to like a Midwest first, you get to the coastal area. And their identity is not fixed in stone, nor any of our identities are fixed in stone. But the Burmese state frees these ethnic identities, that we demarcate ethnic groups as if we were, ethnically pure. Say, for instance, myself, a Burmese, but I have another dominant or old tribal community, and I also have like Indian Northeast ancestry, like Manipuran. I'm not an exception. There is no such thing as pure Burmese or pure Rohingya, and we all mixed. But the state finds it in its interest to freeze these identities so that it can play one against the other. That the old colonial tried and true divide and conquer, whether along religious lines or ethnic lines. So that is actually one of the strategies that the modern Burmese state uses. I avoid the term post-colonial, because it's post-independent state operating on the old colonial structure and using old colonial divide and rule strategies, just so the quote-unquote the ruling class, in our case the military, could keep itself in power. So if you read any newspaper on this subject, you will find a fixed line. Burma has 135 national races, and Rohingyas are not recognized as one of them. And that's very problematic. The practice of census taking like head counts of people who lived in the old feudal Burma started around the late 14th century. In those days, 101 races in the old historical literature. And during the colonial period, British also took censuses, but it wasn't an anthropological survey. It was more like an attempt to organize communities in order to facilitate the administrative control and commercial, activities of the colonial rulers. In that process, from 1824, when Burma first came into violent contact with the British, who were the protector, in quotes, of East Bengal, and Rohingyas and their identities were collapsed under Arakan. Arakan is the name of the region. Whether you're Buddhist or Muslims or Christians or Sikh, you were all lumped under this Arakanese label. It's like residents of the region known as Arakan. But today we call them Rakhine. And then after independence, the Burmese post-independent state started taking census. And then back in 1968, the total list was 67. 67 different ethnic groups or national races were recorded. That was in 1968. In the early 1990s, around the time former Yugoslavia started to dissolve, balkanization, the army found it in its interest to multiply ethnic groups. And that was the time when they started, rolling out this discourse. We have 135 national races. The more the merrier for those who want to divide and, play different communities against one another. So how is it possible that in 1968, this country had 67 officially recorded races or national ethnic groups? Then in 1990s, in a mere span of less than 30 years, that number has doubled. And yet, the media and a lot of academics simply cut and paste this discourse into their writings, whether it's journalistic or academic, 135 national races. And then because the Rohingyas got singled out for persecution, and I'll get into the rationale behind this in a minute, they were denationalized in 1982 with the stroke of a decree. In 1982, we were under the military dictatorship of ex-General Ne Win. It wasn't, we say law, but law has a semblance of legitimacy and popular consent. But this was an act of decree. So, but again, both the Burmese public, the dominant Burmese Buddhist public, and the international media and scholars keep on referring to this act as 1982 Citizenship Act, as if it were, sacrosanct. In 1930s, if you read, literature on Nazi Germany, you will remember that Nazi Party passed the Nuremberg laws. The German Jews were denationalized, stripped of basic citizenship. The spouses or German spouses married to Jewish wives or husbands, they were under extreme pressure to divorce, because the German Jewry was marked as one of the groups that was to be exterminated. In a similar fashion, the Burmese military state denationalized the Rohingyas, who were, up until that point, in official documentation in the forms of citizenship activities like standing for office, serving in the civil service, or even in the most sensitive areas of the state, like armed forces. If Rohingyas were allowed to serve as military personnel or police officers or customs officer, migration officer, or allowed to contribute in the parliamentary politics before the military came to power in 1962. These were the ultimate evidence, ultimate indications of their solid, sense of belonging to this country that we today call Myanmar. But they were subject to this Nuremberg-style set of laws, a single law. And I also know a few people personally who drafted this Citizenship Act. Rakhine nationalist historians, trained in Australia, USA, and also legal scholars that served in the dictatorship, trained in places like United Kingdom or the Netherlands. So here, post-independent state resorting to law as a main instrument of disenfranchisement and persecution. And one of the things that the Burmese military and now even Aung San Suu Kyi's government uses to tell the world that Rohingyas don't belong in Western Burma is the colonial era censuses, where the Rohingya ethnic group was not officially recorded. The official narrative would have you believe that the Rohingyas were nothing but Chittagonians. There's a East Bengal region called Chittagong, who were brought to to the western part of Burma by the British after the first conquest of Burma in 1826. The colonization of Burma proceeded in 3 different stages. And the first was 1824-26, and the coastal region was snatched when the Burmese were defeated. And they say there was no, today even, in the last 25 years, from the heads of state, generals or civilians, down to the public on the, at the street level, would tell anyone that Rohingyas are just Chittagonian agricultural seasonal laborers who refuse to go home, who have overstayed their welcome. They came as British agricultural, quote-unquote, coolies. Coolies is not the word that we wouldn't use today. It's very derogatory. So this was from 1798. It's so interesting, like how history either gets selectively used or erased, depending on the purpose of the state here. So this was published in 1799. This is a linguistic survey conducted by a Scottish medical doctor working for the East India Company in those days. He was an amateurist ethnolinguist. At the time, there was no such thing as ethnolinguistics. So he recorded that the Rohingyas were natives of Arakan, Western Burma. They were Mohammedans, Muslims. And so this is as primary a historical document as you can get. No one could make this up. This was published in Kolkata or Calcutta. But never mind history, historical evidence, or even official documentation that establishes the Rohingya identity, Rohingya presence, and their history as people belonging to Burma, both as an ethnic group of the Union of Burma at the time and as full citizens of the country. This is Burmese encyclopedia in Burmese language. It published in 1964. Rohingya got an entry under the name Mayu district. Mayu is a river along which Rohingyas settle. That's where they engage in agricultural cultivation, fishing, salt farming, and that sort of thing. And majority of them are poor farmers, fishermen, cross-border traders, smugglers, farm laborers. This was published 2 years after the military came to power in 1962. And the other side, what you're looking at is a national registration card issued in 1957, issued to Rohingyas as well. It was done as a pilot project, because in the history of Burma, this was the very first time the idea of a national registration card, or ID, came into being. And the printing press did not arrive in Burma until 1870s. And the printing press was imported by Christian missionaries with the purpose of propagating the gospel. And so, I mentioned earlier 1982 Citizenship Act. The Citizenship Act requires that anyone who would be considered natural citizens, who were born into citizenship essentially, will have to prove their ancestry has settled in Burma before 1824. Before 1824. I think a lot of us, or immigrants in other countries, if we are subject to this kind of law, we wouldn't be citizens. No, I mean, most of you, your parents probably didn't come here until early 1900. You know, and so the bar, the state has set the bar for citizenship eligibility so incredibly high, with the intent of making Rohingya citizenship impossible. Two things are important. Only the Rohingyas are required to prove that they have established their ancestral residency before 1824. No other ethnic group has been subject to this. No other ethnic community in Burma is required by law and by popular opinion to defend their identity. You know, this isn't simply about legal issue. People are forced to defend their own ethnic name. It's simple. If you're, say, like, if you're Sarah or you're John, or, you know, I said, no, you're not Sarah. You are Maya, somebody. And I would hit you. I would, you know, harm you until you admit that you are someone else. And so that is what's happening at the micro level on the street. So just quickly, because when we say the word Rohingya, we see the images of, like, you know, skeleton-like people, you know, crying, wailing mothers, you know, dead bodies. But there was a time, right after independence, Rohingyas were allowed to serve in different services of the government. And I met two gentlemen, because I don't know how to pronounce their last name, and so I call them Socialist Abdul and Teacher and Agriculturalist Abdul. One's a 76-year-old gentleman. He's been in that refugee camp for 20 years, since 1992-93. And this gentleman arrived at a later date. He was a leader of what was then called class cell leader, because we were under the nominally socialist military government, and so they formed like a different class cells. So he served in the Socialist Party, you know, under the military. And the other one was a teacher, 76 years old. So these were people that were so affectionate about not just their homeland, that western coastline, but the whole country. They have such strong sense of belongingness to that place. And their language, Rohingya, is similar to Chittagonian. Yeah, like a Chittagonian would say that they can understand 70% of Rohingya language and vice versa. But that's also not unique to Rohingyas. All the borderland people who live along Burma's borders with China, India, Thailand, you know, they can easily communicate because the boundaries are just fictions. All these like fictionally drawn, you know, like that's why, like, you know, from astronauts will tell you that from the space you don't see boundaries. Yeah? You see geographical, you know, the topology of the Earth. And so the question is, why did the Burmese military single the Rohingyas out, as opposed to other communities that are also borderlands, that have bicultural, bilinguistic, and binational ties? Well, as I showed earlier in one of the slides, the map of Arakan, right next to Bangladesh, Rohingyas are the only Muslim community that have legitimate claim on a small geographic pocket of Burma that is right next to one of the most populous Muslim nations, then called East Pakistan, from 1947 to 1971, before the War of Independence or Liberation, when Bangladesh became an independent sovereign country. Now, there are 17 different types of Muslim communities, you know, depending on their migratory history, their, like, you know, ethnic backgrounds, that are scattered across or throughout Burma. And many of them are, you know, fairly well integrated with the mainstream Buddhist society. But because the Rohingyas are concentrated in that part of the country, even back in 1960s, 75% of Western Burma, the northern Arakan, was predominantly, they were Rohingyas. Yeah? And so because they are Muslims, because they have an ancestral pocket of land, because that land is right next to the populous and poor Bangladesh, Burmese military started to develop this threat perception. Like militaries around the world operate on this paradigm of perceived threats, and then that's how they develop their strategies to deal with, in quotes, national security or defense. So because of that, the military proceeded to frame them as a threat to national security. Yeah? Poor fishermen, farmers, small traders, that had absolutely no links to the Middle East, no links, in terms of the international terrorism. They are not radical. They are not bent on building a caliphate or like Islamic State. And all the Rohingyas wanted was to feel at home and to live in peace like any other ethnic community in Burma. And yet, because of the Burmese military's threat perception, they are seen as potential proxies that could be used by the populous Bangladesh at some point. Yeah. Bangladesh would not attack Burma militarily, but because this community has organic ties to the Chittagong as well as to Arakan, Burma, the military decided that Bangladesh could be pushing its people because of its dense population density, and then gradually snatch the land using the local Rohingya community. So that has been the running threat in terms of rationale behind the Burmese military's persecution. It began in 1978. Yeah? And before 1978, the military began the scheme to change the Muslim character of the region to Buddhist character by what is called like population transfer. Buddhists from other parts of the country, including criminal convicts or inmates serving long-term imprisonment, they're incentivized to go and migrate to this area so that 75% Rohingya population would be tackled to reduce the Muslim number. But because the military did not devote enough resources or make concerted efforts, this peaceful transfer of population to change the demographic character of this region failed. When the peaceful attempt to reshape the demographic nature of the Rohingya region failed, the army typically resorted to terror. And this was the first wave of violence. In 1978 February, in two phases, from February to June, with the Water Festival or New Year break. The Burmese soldiers took a break to celebrate New Year's, resumed the terror campaign after they finished their New Year celebration. So about 280,000 Rohingyas fled the country in a span of 3 or 4 months. So if you go back to the archives and then dig up these materials, you change the bylines, you copy, cut, and paste, you get exactly today's stories. This happened in 1978. There are 5 major waves of exodus that were triggered by the terror. State-directed terror, aided by local Rakhine Buddhist vigilantes. There's a recurring pattern over the last 39 years. That's why we've called this slow-burning genocide. I make a point of saying that Hitler only had about, a decade plus. And these guys, the Burmese military, have been afforded by the world almost 40 years. Still, we're talking, today, actually, as I speak, Today is the first opening day of Euro-Asia meeting. 50 countries, 30 from Europe and European Union, and 20, including China, India, South Korea, Japan, all these like Asian powerhouses are there, speaking in the Burmese capital called Naypyidaw with Suu Kyi and others. Yeah? And they're still talking about negotiating, bilateral negotiation. I mean, can you imagine in the 1940s, the Western allies attempted to negotiate with Hitler over Auschwitz or other places? That's unthinkable. And yet, here we're talking about negotiating with the genocidal regime. If you kill one person, you go to jail for homicide. If you kill countless number of people, including babies, over the last 39 years, you are given an opportunity to negotiate. I mean, what kind of global justice system do we have? And I'll go a few more slides quickly and then I'll stop. We use normal vocabularies, Rohingya villages. That's very misleading. These are essentially open prisons. The word village connotes that you can go about your business of making a living, raising children, securing like educational opportunities, or like going to a clinic. But that's not the case. The Burmese military has used every single instrument at its disposal to essentially, destroy this community from its very foundation, starting with the identity. If you read the original essay by like Raphael Lemkin, published in the early 1930s, Lemkin was the guy who, Jewish, Polish, young lawyer at the time, who coined the term genocide. Not just killing, destroying an ethnic, religious, racial, or national community with the intent to either partially or wholly destroy the community. That the intent is there, and all the instruments, the military, the civil administration, field intelligence, police, special branch, immigration, customs department, religious affairs department, they're all like interagency units. They control Rohingya villages. They turn the Rohingya villages into a web of security zones. A pregnant woman cannot move from village A to village B, where there might be a village clinic with a nurse, no doctors, without being noticed by the police informers from within the Rohingya community or the security checkpoints. Yeah? This is important because this actually challenges the official narrative that Rohingya militants, about 3,000 of them, armed with machetes, primitive tools, spears, farm tools, and attack 30 different security units manned by the Burmese military and police force. Imagine this. If you're a pregnant woman wanting to see a nurse, you cannot move from your village to the other place, to where the clinic is, without being noticed. Last year in October, the Physicians for Human Rights brought out a report documenting how severely restricted access to medical care among the Rohingya community. And then we and the world have been told that 3,000 young men, angry and desperate, were able to launch a coordinated attack on 30 different security outposts. That was a honey trap. That was a perfect pretext the military wanted, so that they could tell the world that all they were doing was defending the state sovereignty, state territory, in the face of these militant groups with ties to Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. That's a fiction that we've been told, and that's a fiction that policymakers around the world have been repeating. And people, at this point, like in the last 2 months, from the highest level of UN bureaucracy to the human rights organizations, the word to describe what is happening in Burma is ethnic cleansing. And I avoid the word ethnic cleansing for two reasons. Because it's euphemism first used by Milosevic. Ethnic cleansing has no legal basis in international criminal law. There are only three types of crimes that have solid legal basis: war crimes, crimes against humanity, and the crime of all crimes, namely the genocide. So, but UN is, as an institution, not prepared to call a genocide by its very legal name, because once it's recognized as genocide, a situation is dubbed a genocide. The Article 1 of the Genocide Convention obligates member states to act, including, using military force to stop the genocidal atrocities. It's slow burning because the military has created conditions which are essentially and intentionally designed to make life impossible. Yeah? And so like the people who argue against or who are unpersuaded by the genocide argument, they say, proof, we have to find the smoking gun, the intent. How do you prove the intent? The intent can be inferred from the acts that the state have been carrying out. Population control, like I said, this population is controlled simply because of their religious and ethnic identity. In China, they have one-child policy across the board. In rural area, enforcement is lax, but in urban area, it is enforced strictly. But in Burma, only Rohingyas out of the so-called 135 different national races, or if they're not within that cluster, they have to submit marriage applications to get licenses. And on the application form, they have to sign the pledge that Rohingyas will not have more than 2 children each family. There's nothing wrong with a state trying to regulate the population through peaceful means for food and other purposes. But when a community is singled out on the basis of ethnicity, that again takes us to the realm of genocide. And then the destruction of cultural and intellectual class. We won, as a country, UN award for combating illiteracy in the 1970s. And the Rohingyas have played, intellectual and cultural roles in the life of Burma. Today, that community, 80% of Rohingya adults are illiterate. And that is the product of state policy, depriving them of educational or literacy opportunities. And then, if you look at the malnutrition rates, over 80,000 children, this was from World Food Program published a few months ago, are in semi-famine situation, sub-Saharan situation. Yeah? And Lemkin called this racial feeding. In concentration camps, the SS and other Nazi organizations calculated how much nutritional intake would be provided to different communities depending on the race. The Germans, the Aryans would get food that was 80 to 90% nutritious, and the Poles would get maybe 50 or 60%, and then the Jews would get 17%, 15%. And the denial of essential health services, and then finally, look at the staggering statistics. For the Rohingyas, one doctor would be expected to treat 158,000 Rohingyas, and national average is one doctor is to 685. And finally, the infant mortality rates 4 times higher among the Rohingya infants. So these conditions actually perfectly fit the Article 2C of the Genocide Convention. You know, like we have a term, like a phrase. There are so many ways to skin a cat. What we are seeing is the mediagenic images of, like, you know, hundreds of thousands of young women and children filing out, or like gory details of, like, you know, dead bodies. Yeah, but that is only the tip of the iceberg. The real issue is this: this community has been subject to genocidal conditions that have been maintained for the last 40 years. So I'm going to stop there.